Welcome to Roasted Pages. Before we dive into the fascinating life of Steve Jobs, don't forget to follow our channel for more freshly roasted book summaries.
And we are really going for the main course today with this deep dive.
We really are. It's not just a tech biography.
No, it's a modern Greek tragedy, a business manual, and honestly kind of a psychological thriller, all wrapped into one. We are unpacking the definitive biography, Steve Jobs, by Walter Isaacson.
It is a beast of a book. But you know what struck me immediately was the setup.
The lack of control, you mean?
Exactly. We all know Jobs was this infamous control freak. He controlled every pixel on the screen, every single curve on the phone case.
Right.
Yet he initiates this biography with Isaacson and explicitly promises not to interfere. He didn't even read the manuscript before it hit the shelves.
Which is so counterintuitive.
Yeah.
He called Isaacson back in 2004 to pitch the idea. He effectively said, I want you to write my life story, and I want it to be honest.
Yeah, he even told him about things he wasn't proud of, like getting his girlfriend pregnant at 23 and handling it poorly.
He wanted no skeletons left in the closet. He specifically said he wanted his rough edges on display.
And that phrase, rough edges, that does a lot of heavy lifting in this story. Because the mission for us today isn't to just recount the history of the iPhone or list the specs of the original Mac.
If you're listening to this, you likely know the product timeline already.
Right. We want to understand the engine behind it. We want to understand how a personality that was often toxic and demanding and frankly cruel was also the exact same mechanism that created the most valuable company on Earth.
We're asking the big question. Was the jerk factor a bug in the system? Or was it a feature?
Could you have had the Apple we know today if Steve Jobs had been a nice, reasonable manager?
Probably not.
So let's start at the bedrock. The psychology of Steve Jobs begins before he ever even touched a circuit board. It starts with his adoption. Isaacson spends a lot of time on this core wound.
He does. So Jobs was born to Joanne Schiebel and Abdulfateh Jandali, but they gave him up for adoption essentially because of family pressure. He was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple. Now, for a lot of people, adoption is just a fact of life. But for Jobs, it created this warring duality in his psyche.
Yeah, on one hand, he had this deep-seated feeling of abandonment.
Exactly. Friends like Andy Hertzfeld argued that his obsession with control came directly from this. The idea being, if you control your environment completely, you can't be abandoned again.
But Jobs himself hated that narrative, right? He spun it totally differently.
Oh, he grew furious if anyone called Paul and Clara his adoptive parents. He insisted they were his parents, 1,000%.
Because he focused on the fact that his biological parents gave him away, but Paul and Clara chose him.
He told Isaacson, I was special. I was chosen. So you have a guy walking around with a massive chip on his shoulder about being unwanted, but also a literal messiah complex about being the chosen one.
That is a volatile cocktail. And speaking of Paul Jobs, the father who chose him, he seems to be the source of the most important design philosophy Apple ever had.
The story about the fence.
Yes, the fence. It's the foundational myth of Apple's quality control.
Paul was a mechanic, a guy who really knew how to build things with his hands. One day they were building a fence in the backyard in Mountain View. Paul told Steve they needed to sand and paint the back of the fence just as carefully as the front.
And Steve was just a kid, so he asked the logical question, why? Nobody's ever going to see it. It faces the house or the neighbor's yard. Who cares?
And Paul's answer wasn't about marketing or sales. It was purely moral.
He said, but you will know.
It's the idea of integrity in the dark.
Yeah.
You do the work right, not because someone is checking, but because you sleep better, knowing the craftsmanship is pure through and through.
You can draw a straight line from that wooden fence to the inside of the original Macintosh. Jobs drove his engineers crazy because he demanded the circuit board look beautiful.
He wanted the chips to be lined up perfectly straight.
Wow.
The solder joints had to be clean.
The engineers were screaming at him, Steve, it's inside a sealed plastic case. The only people who will ever see this are repairmen.
And Jobs' response was effectively his father's voice. We will know.
He treated a mass-produced electronic appliance like it was a piece of fine cabinetry.
It's totally irrational from a business standpoint because it adds cost and time. But it created a culture where good enough was an insult.
It also highlights where he stood in the cultural landscape. He didn't see himself as an engineer.
He saw himself as an artist. He was obsessed with Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid, who talked about standing at the intersection of the humanities and science.
Because Jobs was a hippie. He dropped acid, he listened to Dylan, he went to India seeking enlightenment.
But he also loved electronics. His superpower was being the translator between the poetry of the counterculture and the rigid logic of the circuit board.
But he couldn't do the rigid logic alone. He needed a partner. He needed the Woz.
Steve Wozniak.
Yeah.
The Mozart of digital logic.
The dynamic between them is so funny because they are opposites in almost every way. Woz is this gentle, socially awkward genius who just wants to build cool stuff to show off at the homebrew computer club.
He has zero interest in money. If Jobs hadn't been there, Woz probably would have given the Apple ID schematics away for free to anyone who asked.
He actually tried to.
He did. And Jobs is the one who steps in and says, no, we can sell this. But there's a specific pre-Apple adventure that I think really cemented their partnership.
The blue box.
Yes. This is where they learned they could manipulate the world.
It's such a classic hacker story. So Wozniak reads an article in Esquire about phone phreaks. These were guys who figured out that the entire AT&T phone network was controlled by sound frequencies.
If you played a specific musical note, the network thought you were an operator.
Right, specifically a 2600 hertz tone.
Which, incredibly, was the exact same frequency that came out of a chaotic toy whistle found in a box of Captain Crunch cereal.
You can't make this up.
Woz, being the genius, builds a digital device, a blue box, that can replicate these tones perfectly. You hold it up to a phone receiver, press a button, and you can make free calls anywhere in the world.
You're effectively hacking the largest machine mankind had ever built, the telephone network.
And naturally, they use it to prank call the Vatican.
Right. Wozniak pretended to be Henry Kissinger and tried to get the Pope on the line.
He almost succeeded, too. But beyond the pranks, Jobs realized something profound. They had built a tiny device in a garage that could control billions of dollars of infrastructure.
Jobs told Isaacson later, it gave us the confidence that we could build things that could control the world.
It was their first taste of leverage.
And we also have to mention his time at Atari before Apple.
Oh, absolutely. That was a huge influence.
He learned simplicity from the arcade game instructions, which had basically no manuals, just drop in a quarter and play.
And he learned that intense, take no prisoners attitude from the founder Nolan Bushnell.
Right. That confidence, that aggression, it morphed into something else as Apple grew. We really have to talk about the reality distortion field.
A term coined by Bud Tribble at Apple, borrowed from Star Trek.
And it wasn't just a metaphor.
No, it was a genuine psychological phenomenon surrounding Jobs. He could convince himself and anyone in his orbit that impossible things were possible simply through the force of his own will and charisma.
Is it fair to call it lying, though? Because it sounds a lot like lying.
It's complicated. It definitely included lying. But it was also a form of self-delusion that became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. He would walk into a meeting with the Macintosh team and say, we're shipping in January.
Even when everyone knew the engineering was 6 months behind, he would just stare at them, unblinking, and say, no, we are shipping in January. You can do it. Don't be afraid.
And the crazy thing is they would do it. They would work 90-hour weeks, burn themselves out, and somehow achieve the impossible because he refused to accept reality.
He literally bent reality. But there's a serious flip side. The reality distortion field meant he also ignored facts he didn't like.
If a sales number was bad, it didn't exist. If a person had a valid critique, they were invisible.
And tragically, we saw this at the very end of his life. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he spent 9 months refusing surgery.
Trying to cure it with fruit diets and magical thinking.
Exactly. He thought he could distort the reality of biology, just like he distorted the reality of a product launch.
That binary view of the world, it works for software, the ones and zeros, but it's brutal for people. Isaacson talks about this dynamic a lot.
The gods versus bozos dichotomy. In Jobs' mind, you were either an enlightened genius or a complete moron. There was no middle ground.
And you could switch categories in 5 minutes.
You could show him a brilliant idea at 9 a.m. and be a god, and by 10 a.m. say something slightly off and be a bozo.
It kept people in a state of terror. But the uncomfortable part is it also kept them performing at an elite level. They were desperate to stay in the God category.
It fed into his absolute perfectionism. Think about the Apple II case.
Oh man, he rejected 2,000 shades of beige for the plastic case.
2000. He spent days arguing about exactly how rounded the corners of a rectangle should be on the screen.
He even demanded a 1-year warranty on the Apple II when the industry standard was 90 days.
It literally made his first CEO, Mike Markula, tear up because it was so stressful and unheard of.
Let's talk about when that behavior finally backfired. He gets kicked out of Apple in 1985 after the famous showdown with John Scully.
The guy he recruited by asking, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life or do you want to come with me and change the world?
Exactly. So he's in the wilderness. He starts a new company called Next T. And reading this section, it feels like Jobs is completely unleashed.
No board of directors, no constraints, just pure, unfiltered Steve.
And Next T is maybe the most interesting failure in tech history. He decides to build a computer for the higher education market, but his perfectionism just goes completely off the rails.
He demands the computer be a perfect 12-inch cube.
Why a cube?
Pure aesthetics. He loved the symmetry. But making a perfect cube of magnesium with sharp 90-degree angles is a manufacturing nightmare. The molds alone cost a fortune.
And then he turns his attention to the factory itself.
Right. He demanded the factory robots be painted in specific shades of grayish black to create a Zen aesthetic for the machines.
He was painting the robots that weren't even for sale.
He was scrubbing the factory floors himself because they weren't clean enough.
Just burning through cash, obsessing over those back-of-the-fence details while totally ignoring the market reality that no university wanted to pay $6,500 for a student computer.
Next T was a commercial disaster. They barely sold any hardware.
And this is a massive, but Next T is the reason you and I are using iPhones today.
Correct. Because while the hardware was a vanity project, the software was a masterpiece. The operating system Next T Step was built on something called object-oriented programming.
Okay, let's unpack that. Object-oriented sounds like serious buzzword soup. What did that actually mean for the engineers?
Think of it like Lego. Before this, writing software was like writing a novel. You started at page 1 and wrote every line of code from scratch.
So if you wanted a print window, you wrote the entire code for it.
Exactly. But Next Step provided pre-built blocks. Here's a print window block. Here's a scroll bar block. You just snap them together.
It allowed developers to build apps 10 times faster than on Windows or the old Mac OS.
So when Apple eventually bought NXT in 1997, they weren't really buying a failed hardware company. They were buying the digital Lego blocks that would eventually become Mac OS and iOS.
And they were buying Steve Jobs back.
Yeah.
He returns to Apple as the ICEO. The company is literally 90 days away from bankruptcy at this point.
And this begins the greatest turnaround in business history.
He starts with the Think Different campaign. The posters of Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso. It feels like obvious marketing genius now, but at the time it was super risky.
Because it wasn't just an ad campaign for the customers, it was an internal memo to the employees.
Right, he was telling the beaten-down Apple engineers, we aren't just making beige boxes like Dell, we are the crazy ones, we are artists.
He was rebooting the culture back to that intersection of humanities and science.
Oh, and we skipped over Pixar. While he was in the wilderness, he bought the computer graphics division from Lucasfilm.
Right, because he respected them. They were mixing art and technology just like he wanted to.
And that side bet paid off massively when Toy Story came out. It made him a billionaire again and proved he could strike lightning twice.
It gave him the immense leverage he needed when he went back to Apple.
And when he gets back, he finds a new partner to replace Wozniak, a design soulmate. Jony Ive.
Jony Ive, the head of design. They had this total Vulcan mind meld. They would walk around the studio looking at prototypes, and they shared this very specific philosophy of inevitability.
Inevitability, what does that look like in practice?
It's the idea that a product shouldn't look designed. It shouldn't look like a human drew it and added features to it. It should look like it fell from the future fully formed, like it simply had to be that way.
When you look at the first iPod or the iPhone, it doesn't look like a gadget with a bunch of buttons glued on. It looks like a singular, inevitable object.
Think about the original iMac. They put a handle on the top, not to carry it, but to make it feel approachable, friendly.
Or the iMac G4 that was inspired by a sunflower, separating the screen from the base entirely.
Speaking of the iPhone, there's a story about the screen that I think sums up the Jobs management style perfectly. The Gorilla Glass incident.
This is vintage Jobs. So we are weeks away from the iPhone launch. The prototype has a plastic screen.
Jobs is carrying it in his pocket with his keys, and he pulls it out one day and sees a huge scratch. He goes completely ballistic. I won't sell a product that gets scratched. He demands glass.
But glass shatters,
Yeah.
and nobody was making glass that strong and thin at that massive scale.
So he remembers a company called Corning in upstate New York. He forces his way past a secretary to get a meeting with their CEO, Wendell Weeks.
And he tells Weeks, I need massive amounts of scratch-resistant glass, and I need it in 6 weeks.
Weeks basically laughs at him. He says, we have a glass called Gorilla Glass that we developed in the 60s, but we shelved it. We don't have the factory capacity. It's impossible.
And this is where the reality distortion field kicks in at the highest corporate level.
Jobs just stares at him. He doesn't offer more money. He doesn't negotiate. He just says, get your mind around it. You can do it.
He stared down the CEO of a major industrial company until the guy blinked.
And they converted a factory in Kentucky practically overnight. They worked 24/7, and they delivered the glass.
It's terrifying, but it worked. If he had accepted a perfectly reasonable no, we'd all be tapping on scratch plastic screens right now.
That's the crux of it right there. He was completely unreasonable, but progress depends on the unreasonable man.
Let's zoom out to the competitive landscape. Throughout the book, there is this looming shadow of Bill Gates. They're essentially the Batman and Joker of the tech world.
I won't ask you to clarify which is which.
Good, but their philosophies were diametrically opposed.
It really comes down to integrated versus open. Bill Gates was a pragmatist. He wanted his software Windows to be on every machine in the world. Dell, HP, Lenovo, it didn't matter.
Yeah. He didn't care if the hardware was ugly as long as the software was licensed. It was the open Wild West approach.
And Jobs was the absolute opposite. The walled garden.
Total integration, hardware, software, content services, all strictly controlled by Apple.
Jobs believed that if you let other manufacturers touch the hardware, they would ruin the experience. He called them bozos.
He couldn't stand the idea of his beautiful software running on a clunky plastic laptop with a bunch of stickers all over it.
For the longest time, it looked like Gates had won. Microsoft completely ruled the 90s. But in the long run, the walled garden won the profit war.
Because it turns out people actually like a curated experience. They like it when things just work.
There is a really poignant scene at the end of the book. Jobs is dying. He's at his house in Palo Alto. And Bill Gates comes to visit him.
That must have been incredibly heavy.
It was. They sat there, these two titans who basically shaped the late 20th century. And they reached a sort of truce.
Gates admitted that Jobs' model worked right.
Yeah, he acknowledged that Apple was becoming the most valuable company on earth because the products were perfect. And Jobs admitted that Gates's open model worked too because it democratized computing. They were both right.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to look at the legacy. It's easy to point to the devices, the phone in your pocket, the tablet on your desks, the laptop.
He disrupted personal computers, animated movies, music phones, tablet computing, digital publishing. It's a staggering list.
But if you asked Jobs, he wouldn't say that iPhone was his greatest invention.
You know, he told Isaacson his greatest creation was Apple, the company.
Because he was obsessed with Hewlett-Packard when he was young, a company that lasted for generations.
He wanted to build an organism, an entity that could continue to invent and innovate long after his own DNA was gone.
And that leads us to the final difficult question the book poses. We started by talking about his rough edges, the screaming, the reality distortion, the cruelty.
The question is, did he succeed despite being a jerk or because of it?
It's so tempting to say, oh, he could have been nicer and still been a genius.
But Isaacson concludes that the personality and the products were completely integrated, just like the hardware and the software. You couldn't pull them apart.
His total intolerance for good enough, his complete lack of empathy for people who didn't deliver absolute perfection, that was the fuel.
It's a provocative thought to leave you with. Is unreasonable perfectionism and a highly difficult personality actually required to change the world?
Or could he have achieved the exact same results with kindness? The book strongly suggests his flaws and his genius were inseparable. A heavy thought for a heavy book.
Absolutely.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for exploring the reality distortion field with us.
See you in the next one.